You spent more than 20 years in public service. The achievements when you're in those roles are very public. They're there for everyone to see, but so are the disappointments and the failures, especially with social media, that people can say what they think about what you've done. How do you balance those pressures with your private life?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It's great to have successes. Things always go wrong. No one's perfect, and people are very happy to point out your failings when things go wrong. And I think I've certainly noticed over the 20 years that I've been doing things in various forms of public life, the change in social media has absolutely made things more difficult. Largely because people are obviously willing to say things to you online that they wouldn't necessarily say to your face. I think that's brought with it a little bit that people are probably now more willing to say things to your face than they would have been 10 or 20 years ago. But I think that's almost the conditioning of the way some of the online debate has gone. And it can have an impact on your families. I'm someone who lives locally. I bring up my family locally. I'm not one of these people who tries to compartmentalize that away from everything else, because my family are my life, the community I live in is my life, and so there is naturally a bleed across. But I'm always very clear with people that it's me that you should be having a go at, not my family. That's where the line is. But ultimately, I think you've got to be comfortable with the decisions you make, whatever they happen to be. And as long as you are confident that you're doing the right things for the right reasons and always trying to achieve your best, then at least you can sleep at night and live with the criticism that you get.
Explain your role as Police and Crime Commissioner, because it's a political role as well as a leadership role. So how much of the decision making is political and how much of it is just like being involved in a big organisation?
Yeah, so a lot of people still don't get the idea of a police and crime commissioner. Of course, we're being abolished in 2028. It's still a relatively new thing, but the idea of having civilian oversight over policing is not new. And since Robert Peel created the first police force in the Metropolitan Police, there was always some form of civilian oversight, usually by local politicians. The only difference with the police and crime commissioner model is it's someone who's directly elected and therefore directly accountable. And I think that brings real value. So my job is absolutely not operational. I can't tell the chief constable or any of his police officers who to go and arrest or to not arrest someone there for a friend of mine. I wouldn't want to, and it's absolutely right that there's that really clear demarcation. But my role is very much about overseeing policing, challenging the chief constable and the force to make sure they're doing what the public would want them to do, setting the budget for the force, and setting out the priorities when I talk to the public about the things that they say they want to see, and making sure that the force do their best to deliver those things. And that's where the politics comes into it. It's not a massive left-right split generally in policing, but actually I set out at my last election and the one before that, my manifesto of what I said to people that I would do, focusing on cutting crime and catching criminals, that's getting some of the basics of policing right. And that manifesto I turned into my police and crime plan, which is the document that I then challenged the chief constable to deliver. And it's really important that people recognise that distinction between the operational and the strategic. They do come together at times, and I think very importantly to make sure that we do the best for the public. But there's also a role in terms of challenging the government on behalf of the public and policing to make sure we get the best deal in terms of funding, or indeed get changes in the law that the police need to protect people in Thames Valley.
So in terms of priorities and changes that you've made, what difference have you made in your time?
So I think the one standout thing that whatever happens in the future I will be proud of is the way we've tackled knife crime in Thames Valley. When I was first elected back in 2021, it really did feel like there was a crisis around knife crime. We were certainly not an outlier. We were comparatively safe in terms of what you saw across the rest of the country. But there were far too many young men being killed by other young men using knives. Now, have we eradicated the problem? No, of course we haven't. But we've seen year-on-year reductions. And that has come about because of great police work that, frankly, is down to the jobs of police officers on the ground doing very important and brave things, but also because I challenged the force in some of the processes that we had. And we introduced a process called Operation Deter in Thames Valley, and making that introduction of Operation Deter means that if you're caught with a knife in Thames Valley, more often than not, you will find yourself charged and remanded overnight and in magistrates' court the next day charged with that offence. And that is a massive difference from what we saw beforehand in Thames Valley and from what, sadly, we still see in other parts of the country where knife possession was taken as a relatively low-level offence. So the work we've done to really drive down knife crime, to make it really clear to people that carrying a knife is unacceptable, and that we won't fluff around with little diversion programs here and there, but actually we will really come down hard on people who are carrying knives because it is a precursor event. And of course, we should be concerned about people who are committing robberies or stabbing people, but none of those offences can ever take place unless someone's first carrying a knife. So really good use of stop and search. We have some of the highest rates of stop and search in Thames Valley, but we also have some of the highest success rates of stop and search in the whole country. So I think if there's one thing that I can be confident has actually saved lives because of the work we've done in Thames Valley and those things that I've been involved in implementing, it's absolutely Operation Deter, which has reduced the number of people who are killed by knives in our force. But there's a number of other things I would point to, including the work we've done around rural crime. That was one of those areas that was frankly neglected by many police forces in the country. We now have what's recognised as the best and almost the biggest neighbourhood team who is doing rural crime. So a rural crime task force, which is one of the biggest in the country, award-winning now, and we've seen more than 30% reductions in rural crime. It sounds to some people quite quaint, rural crime, a little bit of hair coursing. It's nothing too serious, damage to crops. We're seeing organised crime groups who are causing millions of pounds worth of damage, stealing millions of pounds worth of equipment, and this stuff is being shipped across the continent, shipped across the globe. And the plans that we put in place in Thames Valley mean that actually we are cracking down on those criminals. We've seen an increase in the number of arrests, those sentences for those crimes, and farmers, landowners, developers who have large building sites in Thames Valley are really seeing the benefits in falling crime rates.
You say crime rates are falling, but there is still very much fear of crime for many people. What do you think fear of crime tells us?
So I think there's several issues around the fear of crime. It really matters. It is no good someone like me sitting here and saying, well, statistically, you're very unlikely to be a victim of crime if people are so frightened they won't go out of their own homes. So your perception matters almost as much as the reality. We need to rightly focus on the reality, and we can demonstrate that crime is falling and we are now a safer society than we have been. But if people don't feel that way, then we aren't doing our jobs completely. And I think there are a couple of areas where we need to look at. One is around social media, again, which touched on at the start. Social media can create a feeling of a lack of safety. And I've seen it where a small incident that happens in one of our market towns in Thames Valley can be spread on social media and seen hundreds of thousands of times by people many miles away who instinctively feel a little bit less safe because they've seen something happen not that far away from them, and it feels like it's happened to them. But it hasn't, and they haven't been victims. And actually, often those incidents are dealt with very swiftly and promptly by the police. But of course, the bad news is what travels fast, and not the good news. So we need to be able to convey that message to the public. We need to be able to reassure people that actually some of the things that they see online, some of the myths about modern policing, aren't real. And so actually demonstrating that our communities are safe, giving people confidence to go out and enjoy their lives freely without that fear of crime is really important. We do that through visible policing, and we should do that through tackling some of those misconceptions on social media themselves.
Many people feel that there isn't enough visible policing. They don't see enough police officers around on the streets. Often when I've been in town centres, they can feel like threatening places. There are a lot of teenagers gathering there. They can be quite noisy. If there are security guards, they're not really empowered to do anything about it. So I suppose that feeds into it, that at times when it feels like potentially trouble might flare, or you might have someone shouting aggressive things at you, there's no one around. So how do you conquer that problem of people thinking, I don't see any police officers, but you say there is visible policing?
Well, I think we've got two things here. We've got the overall numbers of police officers in a force like Thames Valley, and then we've got the visibility of them. And I think we need to recognise we've got 500 more police officers than we had back in 2010. So 2010 is recognised as that high point, and undoubtedly we saw reductions during the 2010s. People talk about 20,000 being lost, but we didn't just replace those in Thames Valley. We've got 500 more officers now than we had previously, more police officers than ever before. So that's really positive. But then you need to look at what those officers are doing. And about 20% of all calls to Thames Valley Police today, yesterday and sadly tomorrow will be relating to domestic abuse. And these are offences that go on behind closed doors that we would all want the police to deal with. They're sadly not new crimes. They're crimes that took place, arguably were more prevalent 30, 40, 50 years ago. The difference is now the police are dealing with them and dealing with them much more effectively. So that undoubtedly drives demand for the police in areas that aren't maybe seen by the public. But what we have done at the same time is recognise, well, we need to do those public-facing things that provide some reassurance. So working with the Chief Constable over the last 3 years, we've more than doubled the number of officers in our neighbourhood policing teams. They're not just out there patrolling our streets, important though that is. They're getting to know the communities. So it's not just about wandering aimlessly around our town centres. There's a time and a place for those foot patrols. But actually, it's talking to people at the school gate, finding out which routes home the children don't want to go because the older boys are being a bit intimidating or they're concerned about having something stolen from them. It's about understanding the routes which women in our community don't want to go for a run in the evening because they're not well lit and they fear harassment from people. So those things often aren't in our town centres, in the really visible places. It's about being where the biggest risk is and where the threat is to the public. And we need to balance all of those competing demands.
You would, of course, need more officers because areas like Didcot and Wantage are expanding. So more people are living there. You would need more people more police on the streets to police those neighbourhoods. Absolutely.
And in an ideal world, we would certainly have more. We hear the current government talking about, I think, called the neighbourhood policing guarantee. In my view, it is really disingenuous in terms of what they're suggesting we're going to have in terms of what they're telling the public. We've seen an announcement about the number of police officers, around 60 that we're having this year. That's great. We are funding those officers. We're putting another 60-odd police officers out on the streets of Thames Valley in neighbourhood roles. But the Home Office are only funding 40% of that. And so that cost has to be met from somewhere else within the organisation and frankly by having to put council tax up at the same time. So we all want to see more, but we're not being supported by the Home Office to deliver that continued growth. And there's a huge amount of smoke and mirrors, sadly, in terms of police funding. And with the plans that the government has for wider police reform, what we're actually seeing is a lot of money being wasted at the centre on new quangos that are being set up, taking hundreds of millions of pounds out of frontline policing.
In terms of visibility, there's balancing the budget, isn't there, between crimes that are solved in offices like cybercrime, online scams and frauds, and the stories that often make the papers, which is about shoplifting or people saying they were broken into and nobody comes around for a burglary. So how do you balance that? Because the shoplifting situation has caused huge problems, hasn't it, in terms of the reputation of the police. It looks like the police don't care about people stealing people's livelihoods.
So you're absolutely right. There's a huge amount of crime that goes on behind closed doors that won't be solved by a police officer on patrol in a high-vis jacket and a big custodian helmet that we absolutely need to deal with. About 40% of all crime is thought to be online in some way. And so the threat to all of us as citizens is sometimes hidden away. And we can't leave that free for criminals to take advantage of people. But you're right. There's a huge misconception in my view around attendance at burglary, and I happened to meet with a lady last night who was concerned about a burglary that she'd been a victim of in a series in her village, and actually her and all the other victims were genuinely impressed by that really early quick response that they got from Thames Valley Police. And I have met so many victims of burglary who I wish had not been victims in the first place, but they're genuinely impressed because their expectation is that nobody comes along and deals with burglary anymore. It's a really serious crime. It's one of those areas that I challenge the Chief Constable on around burglary attendance to make sure that the response that the public get is what they would expect, and rightly so, because it's hugely impactful. So actually burglary crime is falling, has been falling for years, and the response is good to it. But we can't ever take the pressure off on that. And you touch on shoplifting again, which is you've have to been living under a rock if you haven't seen some of the concerns that people have had about shoplifting. I think quite rightly so. It's an area that I took up in Thames Valley a number of years ago now, and actually I met with a manager of a local Budgeons franchise, and she was telling me about the appalling service she'd had from Thames Valley Police. And I said, well, don't just tell me. I took her to a conference we were hosting in Thames Valley and got her to stand on stage in front of about 150 police officers, and she was absolutely terrified. She wasn't used to doing the public speaking, but her first-hand testimony of the really poor response that she'd had from Thames Valley Police genuinely made everybody in that room in a uniform feel ashamed. And that's unfortunate, but it had the impact, because actually what we've seen is a real change in the way Thames Valley Police in particular deal with shoplifting now. And actually part of the problem these days is getting retailers to report things. Now, partly that's a lack of confidence, partly it's sometimes corporate policies which actually put staff off reporting things and intervening. You will have seen the headlines recently about a member of staff at Waitrose who lost their job for actually doing the right thing and stepping in to try and support someone. And it's an issue I raised directly with Waitrose and said, look, this isn't good enough. You're actually in the long term making your staff more at risk, because Waitrose therefore looks like a target. So I'm really clear that the police need to do their bit. If someone calls 999 and reports a shoplifting, they should get that urgent attendance if there's any chance of actually catching someone. But we also need to follow it through the investigation. So we provided a new route for retailers to report into the police to make it quicker and easier for them to report offences and to share that intelligence amongst local businesses. And since doing that, we've seen more than a doubling of the number of charges for shoplifting. And in the last 12 months, shoplifting offences have come down by 9%. So that is really positive. That's at a time we're making it easier to report. So retailers are not reporting offences, and yet we're seeing crimes coming down. So there is some really good news on our high streets. But again, it's about confidence. It's about making sure that people really feel that they will get that response from the police.
Confidence is such an important word when it comes to the police. How do you build people's confidence? Because you can talk about crime figures coming down, you can talk about people stop and search and people being caught with knives being prosecuted, you can talk about shoplifting rates coming down, but unless people really believe it, unless they see it for themselves and they see publicly those stories spoken about and the success stories, they have no confidence in them and their trust still remains diminished.
I think you're absolutely right. It's about getting the basics right. So when we talk about confidence in policing and trust, there's often a lot of focus, not wrongly. I think it's quite understandable that people look to these awful offences that were committed by Wayne Couzens, for example, in the Metropolitan Police. And sadly, we've had Thames Valley police officers who've done some pretty heinous things and have rightly been dismissed from the force, and in some cases gone to prison for the crimes they've committed. It's quite right that we're rigorous in rooting people out of policing who shouldn't be there in the first place. But actually, those aren't the things that most people raise with me. It's about the basics. It's if I'm burgled and I call 999, will someone come? If I'm a victim, will someone come and help me? Can I get through in a reasonable time on 101 to report something? So we need to get those basics right, and we need to tell that story to people. So visible policing is part of it, making sure that people can physically see those officers out in their communities. But we also need to make sure we're explaining the successes that we have. So not just me telling people that we're doing better about shoplifting, but making it really clear when arrests are made for shoplifting, when we get successful charges and people are locked up, demonstrating that back to retailers in particular. So that's been part of our communications plan with retailers, saying you've reported these offences, this person's now in prison for the next 3 years, and demonstrating that actually the whole system is starting to work much better, with some real challenges around the courts. And I think a lot of the failings in the criminal justice system get blamed on the police because they're seen as the public-facing end of the system. But it's about getting the basics right, time after time, and so that people will actually understand we have made that shift, that the basics about police attendance, police visibility, they are happening. And people will start to understand that and hopefully share that message themselves. The word of mouth from people who've had good interactions with the police is the best advert that we can have.
The court process and the sentencing is another layer that compounds the lack of confidence, the lack of trust. That's not something that the police can control, but is that something you can try to influence in your role as Police and Crime Commissioner? Is that the political part of your role?
Absolutely. The lobbying of government and the attempts to change legislation are really important. I gave evidence both in person and in writing to the committee that was looking at the crime and policing bill. That now is an act of Parliament. It brought through some really important changes, and also, in my view, had some really worrying changes that were put through around sentencing, which will actually make the job of the police harder. We've then seen the Sentencing Act, which is going to make it really difficult to get yourself locked up for any sort of offence unless it's the most serious category. This should concern everybody. Now, part of this undoubtedly is about the lack of prison spaces. Part of it is about the lack of court sitting days and the capacity there. Some of that is to do with process. Some of it is to do with money. And much as I would always want to try and secure as much money as I can for policing, actually, if you look at the system as a whole, there is an argument, and I think some chief constables would agree with this, that actually sometimes it would be better to invest some more money in the courts process and our prisons rather than policing, because actually that means that the people that the police are arresting and taking to court might actually get locked up for a period of time, giving more respite to the public, hopefully doing something to prevent that cycle of offending in the future if we can rehabilitate people. If we just focus on policing on its own, then we're not actually stopping that cycle going through. And I fear at the moment with the Sentencing Act, we'll see increased police activity arresting the same people over and over again who will not be getting sent to prison and will simply come straight back out of police custody and be committing more offences.
You served as Police and Crime Commissioner under a Conservative government and under a Labour government. Do you think, though, now we are in an era where it's no longer two-party politics?
I think I'm a political animal, as you say. I'm a Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner. I think it would be foolish and naive, however, to suggest that any party's got all the answers to this. We saw under the Conservatives, when I was Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner through the time that I was elected, a significant increase in funding for policing, that increase in officers that we saw under the Conservatives, but plenty of things I was happy to challenge that government on in terms of some of the priorities they had. What we see now is genuinely, certainly in my time as Police and Crime Commissioner, the most challenging financial situation that we've seen in Thames Valley with the current Home Office under Labour. There are some real problems coming down the track. It's difficult enough at the moment. I'm really concerned about future years in terms of how we just manage to do the basics and really focus on the things that we know will continue to cut crime in Thames Valley. But you're right, politics is splintering, and I think it's probably been coming down the track for quite a while. There's been lots of talk over recent months about the 10th anniversary of Brexit, and is that what caused the split? Well, actually, I think if you look at it, there's been some disillusion with some of the main parties for a while. But the thing for me is a little bit like what we need to do in policing, getting the basics right. What the public want is delivery, and they want some honesty about the challenges that the country faces. There are lots of things that we want a solution to now, and we can't have them. Some things will take time to change. There are lots of things that, frankly, governments can't fix. And I think actually my view of politics and the way I approach things in policing and in politics more broadly is that actually government doesn't have all the answers. We want a small state that does the things it's supposed to do well and effectively, and then lets the public get on with living their lives, whether that's how you manage your family, how you manage your business, what you want to do with your leisure time. Just get on with it. And the government needs to step back a bit. We certainly saw during COVID the state stepping in a way that, frankly, I think most of us, certainly I never thought that the state would in this country. But we also saw a certain appetite from the public. There were people in the months post lockdown say, oh, well, actually, I'm not quite sure whether I should be doing this or not. I need some guidance from the government to tell me whether I can do this, that, or the other. No, you don't. And we haven't done before, and we don't do now. So perhaps we've created a little bit of dependency on the state, which I'm not sure is healthy. And that leads to high expectations and perhaps removes a bit of agency from individuals, actually, that we need to maybe regain.
Give me an example of something the government can't fix and something it can fix, and can fix quite quickly.
So I think one really interesting observation, I think, would be around the economy. The current government seem to think they can do something to create jobs. Frankly, governments don't create jobs. That's private businesses that create jobs and employ people. What governments can do is create an environment in which businesses can thrive. And we've seen exactly the opposite since 2024, with more bureaucracy being placed on businesses and more cost being placed on businesses. Now, some of that stuff I think is relatively easy to remove because it's about regulation, and you can relatively easily deregulate if you're bold enough to do so. There's some challenges around the levels of taxation because we need to be brave in the things we say. Well, we're not going to fund as a result of this. But a really good example where I think we've got it wrong at the moment is around business rates. There's long been concern about how our high street businesses can ever compete with online retailers and other online service providers because of the levels of business rates that physical real world businesses have to pay. And one of the things I've been campaigning on locally for both hospitality, retail and leisure businesses is the complete removal of business rates, and you pay for that by cutting into the welfare bill, and you have to accept there are things we are not going to be able to afford to do. A big chunk of that comes from welfare, but not that alone. And I think that's the only way you can do it. You have to simply remove and be radical around some of those layers of taxation. One of the alternatives to that, which I've heard from the Lib Dems, was that actually you remove business rates and instead put a tax on landlords. I mean, that's nonsensical and just shows people have no understanding of how business works. Because if you simply tax the landlords, they will increase rents accordingly, and you actually end up with more businesses falling into the category of paying those taxes. So you need to think about how you're going to levy taxation as well as the levels at which we're doing it. And it's something that I think the British state has been failing at for at least a decade.
Do you think people are missing a sense of community? I know there's an element of nostalgia sometimes around how things may have been at a certain point in time, but definitely high streets are changing, pubs are closing, things that would have been at the heart of a village are no longer there, things that would have been in the heart of a town centre are no longer there. Access to the town centre becomes more and more difficult in terms of parking a car or even having buses that go directly to where you want to go. So how much of that do you think would change if you could protect more businesses, encourage them more onto the high street?
So I think community is hugely valuable, and it's one of those areas that, again, it's none of government's business in some ways. That's the sort of thing that is organic and just grows up from community. But what we can try and do is nurture that and create environment in which community can flourish. And the reason I say community matters so much is because whether it's how your village or your town looks in the future, all the way down to some of the things we deal with in policing around young children who are getting into trouble with the police. As human beings, we all have one fundamental desire, and that is to belong. And if we don't belong because we don't feel we've got a family that supports us, or we don't, in the case of the child, we don't feel that we fit in at school, or we're not in the sports team, that's where people will get drawn towards gangs and other sorts of activity which put them outside of society. And it's the same thing on a bigger scale with our towns and villages and our cities across Thames Valley and the local area. People want to feel part of a community. We've seen significant housing development, which means you've got lots of people moving from all over the country, indeed all over the world. And what's really important is we try to build a coherent community that isn't about the breakdown of this group and that group and some of the competing demands that can make, but actually you feel like you belong in the place you live. Now, to some that might seem nostalgic, but I do think it is still something worth striving for because it does work. It does exist. I mean, if you look at some of our most successful communities, if you go to a place like Wallingford has a fantastic community feel to it, and has, so through the summer months, you have a whole string of massive community events that really bring the town together. And that's a town that is growing, and that creates plenty of challenges around infrastructure. But it feels like it's a town that's growing in a way that is truly inclusive and brings people into that sort of activity, which has gone on for generations in that town. And there's no reason why that can't be replicated in other areas.
Do you think it could be replicated in Didcot?
Absolutely. I don't think anywhere is without that ability to have a really strong community. Didcot is the biggest community locally, the biggest town, but it has a fantastic heritage to build on. It has some fantastic, actually within the different estates that have grown up over 20 or 30 years, it has some fantastic activities that go on, and actually a surprising number of community facilities. Often people say there's nothing to do for young kids. Actually, it's loads of sports groups. There's the cadets. There's the uniformed organisations. There's the train youth group in Didcot. There's lots of activities going on, and sometimes there is just that need to try and bring it together and be a bit more positive about the places in which we live. There's lots of people I know who love Didcot, and quite rightly so, because it is a fantastic place with lots of opportunity, links to the rest of the country, great job opportunities locally, some fantastic schools. Why wouldn't it be a place you can be proud of?
Policing is one of the areas we hear, you've said, is underfunded, along with the NHS, defence. Questions have been asked about the amount of money spent on welfare. More money is spent on welfare than comes in through income tax. So how can that be tackled?
Yeah, so I think firstly on the fact that we all want money for something that we love, we need to accept there is not enough money for everybody to have everything that they want. And that goes beyond just the welfare bill. I do think in policing there's things I've proposed to this government and previous governments that actually you can just cut swathes of bureaucracy, stop doing things that are just internal, add costs but don't add any benefit for the public.
But in public organisations, that's very difficult to stop those internal machines where there's a lot of management, there's a lot of meetings, there's a lot of talk, but often not very much is achieved.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge problem, and it needs someone to be brave at the centre, because a lot of this is stuff that's driven by government, and it does need to be brave because often the bureaucracy that's added, whether it be in policing or the NHS or other parts of public life, will sometimes come out of a tragedy. And something will go horribly wrong. Sometimes it might even cost someone their life. And we shouldn't be, I'm not being glib about this. There are times when things have gone catastrophically wrong. But our response as a country is often to add a layer of bureaucracy, of more checks, which grow organically until 15 years later, nobody remembers the original reason why these rules were put into place. And all they've done is add cost to a system which often works less efficiently and protects people worse than it would have done otherwise. So we need to be brave in sometimes saying we got something wrong. We need to focus on the things that must be changed, and some of the other stuff we can't afford to do because actually it will make those services less efficient for the future. But you rightly talk about the welfare bill. I come across a really interesting example recently of a woman who's been out of work for the best part of 10 years. She's been caring for her family, but she had a good career up until the time she decided to leave work. She's recently retrained, but didn't get the job that she was specifically looking for, a reasonably well-paid job. She's taken the decision that actually it's not worth her taking another role, which isn't as well paid as the one she wanted, because the benefit she's been receiving has been receiving for the last decade. Actually, she's quite comfortable. It's got so much so that actually her husband recently turned down a pay rise because it would have put their household income over a level where she would have lost her benefit. So she's perfectly capable of working. She acknowledges she's perfectly capable of working. She can't get the perfect job that she would like. So she's actually quite happy to not work. Her husband's actually turned down a pay rise, which now his employer are paying him back in increased pension contributions. So they're effectively getting around it, still taking the money in for the household, but in a way that means they're still drawing an income from the rest of us. And I don't think that's fair. I don't actually think it's particularly good for her. I think there is a real dignity in work that we often ignore, that people who can work should work. And frankly, it's not fair on everybody else, however comfortable that situation may be for her. So there are lots of examples around that. These are not the fictions that sometimes some of the press like to pick on and say these are ridiculous examples. It's a real world example of someone where that's happening now.
And I suppose the question people ask is, how did we get here?
Yeah, I think COVID has undoubtedly had an impact both on our expectations of the state looking after us. The furlough scheme, very popular at the time, undoubtedly saved probably millions of jobs, but it gave people an expectation that the government can just provide you with an income. Well, that was a very short-lived scheme for a particular reason. It also meant that we don't have the same checks and balances in terms of in-face interviews to claim certain benefits, which were lost during the COVID period. So we've certainly seen that growth. But we also see at the other end an ageing population, and actually of our benefits bill, more than half of that is actually benefits towards pensioners. There's much more sympathy towards a cohort of people who probably aren't in a position to go out and get more employment and therefore generate their own income in the same way that younger people should be able to do. But we need to ask ourselves whether that is sustainable for the future as well. As a country, we have too many people who are living off the state. And if they're living off the state, what they're actually doing is they're living off the rest of us who are working, paying higher levels of taxation, simply to effectively give a living to other people who aren't.
The argument around pensions and the triple lock, which comes up now on a fairly regular basis, some people feel is only on the table to be talked about because of the issues around the amount of other welfare payments, like, for example, PIP. My understanding is that compared to other places in Europe, the response post-COVID has been much slower in the UK for people to return to work. The payment of benefits is much higher. So what can you do? Because nobody wants a cut when the cut affects them.
I think you're absolutely right. We need to tackle both, frankly. And I think we need a really grown-up conversation in the how and why we would do that. So I think I look at these cross-generational issues, because that's really what they are, through the lens of the family. So if I were to ask 10 people in the street who are in their sort of 50s or over, there's probably a general view that the youth of today are work shy, can't get a proper job, they're all scrounging. And if you ask people leaving school and looking for work, there'll be a view that those people who are either in retirement or approaching retirement are hoarding all of the wealth in the country and are not willing to contribute and didn't realise how good they had it in their day. And of course, both can't be right. And if you look at it in individual families, that's rarely the case. There are of those older people that I might talk to, when I talk to a group of my father-in-law's friends in the pub, their general view might be that the young people of today are work shy and lazy. But of course, their grandchildren are the most hard-working geniuses of their generation, and they're doing everything they can. Similarly, those young people who have a view that all the baby boomers are hoarding the wealth, they don't really want to deprive their grandparents and parents of inheriting a home or their ability to live comfortably in their old age. So we take very different views when we look at it through that family lens. And there are trade-offs within those families. And I think that's the way to look at it. As a Conservative, I think the family doesn't have to be the old-fashioned nuclear family, but that sense of belonging within your family should matter to us all. And I think actually what you're asking people to do is you're asking an older generation, if you're looking at the pensions, you're saying, well, you didn't invest for your pension. You paid for your grandparents and your parents to have a pension, and now it's your children who are paying for your pension. Our state pension in this country is the biggest Ponzi scheme there is. So what we're asking you is to take a bit of a hit so that your children have got more chance of getting on the housing ladder themselves, because you were able to get a home at a younger age, and actually that's what people want. And if people can see a direct that family related benefit, so you can see I'm giving up something because people within my family across the generations are likely to benefit from it, then I think it's still a difficult conversation, but I think it's a conversation really worth having. Whereas if you have the conversation in terms that says, well, we're going to take money off pensioners to give it to the work-shy youth who can't be bothered to work, or we're only protecting the pensioners because they're the ones who turn out and vote and you lot can go hang, then actually we have a real mismatch. So I think we need to be really frank with people about what the challenge is, explain it to people in terms of their own families and the people they know, and have policies that will genuinely see people benefit, so they can see why they're having to have some of their benefits or pensions reduced, because we're building a stronger economy and we're building a stronger community as a result.
Any changes to the pension, of course, wouldn't affect the baby boomers, that it would affect the Gen Xers, who I'm sure would argue, as a Gen Xer, that we lived through really difficult financial times, and lots of Gen Xers only have their houses because they saved enough money, they scrimped and saved through those interest rates that were up at 15% during the 80s and 90s. Some people lost their homes in the boom and bust that has stopped because the government has protected the market, so that those rises and falls that we live through haven't been there. And as a Gen Xer, I suppose I would say I spent my life working thinking that I'm going to retire with a state pension. If you are now saying you can't guarantee that's going to be there, I wouldn't be very happy.
No, and I don't get me wrong, I'm in a similar position. Yeah, we're all paying our mortgages. We all, I probably don't really particularly want to retire, but my wife definitely is keen to retire.
I'm super keen to retire
and enjoy those later years of life. I'm just a workaholic. I don't want to give it up. But of course that's perfectly reasonable. But if we genuinely believe in that principle that you should be able, you should work when you can to look after yourself and your family, there's no logical reason why that stops at a particular point. So I wouldn't for a moment suggest we should be taking the state pension away from people. What we need to look at is that growth in the state pension sustainable? Are we really able to promise a decent living to people in retirement purely on the state pension? Or do we need to continue to encourage people more to invest in private pensions? Do we need to look at how those private pensions are invested? Do we need to be more realistic in our provision of the state pension? Is the triple lock sustainable? That seems to be the big question that nobody wants to answer in this country. I don't think it is sustainable for the long term. But of course, the question is, that removing the triple lock doesn't mean you're suddenly reducing people's state pensions. We're talking about reducing the speed at which it would grow. We need to have those frank conversations, because otherwise, those people who might be in receipt of a state pension will see their own family members suffer. As public services become weaker, as I think in many ways the fabric of society that people will have worked for in the past will be less strong. And that's why I think we need that small state, but a strong state. There are those few things that we expect the government to be able to do for us, provide a robust NHS to provide those essential health services, the police to keep us safe at home, and our military to keep us safe abroad, and the provision of a decent education for our children. But if we aren't able to fund those things, then frankly, your relatively small state pension going up by the rate of inflation is going to be little compensation when you see the rest of your family suffering.
Healthcare under strain is something that people feel very strongly about. For you, that's a political issue. It's a personal issue because it's in your family. So in terms of GPs and access to GP services, people find it harder and harder and more frustrating to get to see a GP. The GPs, I think, are finding the level of paperwork and bureaucracy very, very frustrating. Didcot is still missing a GP surgery that was promised. So how do you tackle that? How do you make access to GPs easier? And how in what feel like ever expanding towns do you make sure that provision is there?
Yeah, you're right. I'm obviously married to a GP. It still does a significant amount of work in the NHS, and yet my own family have had plenty of issues in recent months of getting access to a GP and getting access to the operations that are needed, and the long waits for just even a date to get an operation for some things. So these are real issues for people. We know the NHS is still one of the biggest issues on people's list of political priorities, but it is often that access to the local GP, and we've certainly seen in Didcot, as you mentioned, and also to some extent in Wallingford. We've got similar issues around capacity there. We've seen some expansion in Wantage, but there are still certainly problems about access. In Didcot, it's just a failure to build a new facility, and this is one of those things which has nothing to do with the medical side of the NHS, not really much to do with the funding side of the NHS, but a huge amount to do with the bureaucracy. So if you take Great Western Park, the developers have provided the land and they provided the money that they were required by the planning system to build the surgery. And yet we've had years, literally years, of waiting for NHS England and its various other partner agencies to actually get their act together, to work on the commissioning, to get a design, to get the planning permission, and to get the thing built. And we thought, so many people thought we were almost there. And then, of course, NHS England then pull the rug again, and we almost start from scratch. A huge frustration to people who moved into development 15 years ago, have everything in theory lined up. We know which doctor's practice is going to take it over. They've got an expansion plan. We've got the money from the developers. But it's actually the NHS bureaucracy that fails to get this stuff sorted. So that's where I do think we need this proper root and branch review of some of the bureaucracies, rip out some of the red tape that exists. And that does take a little bit of bravery, because every little bit of bureaucracy that people get frustrated with will be there for the right reason at some point in the dim and distant past, around procurement, around alleviating risk somewhere. So we need to be really brave, and we need to just bash heads together to say that we've got the money. We don't. It's not about a massive injection of cash. It's about getting the bureaucracy working for the people of Didcot.
But how do you? I know you're talking about brave decisions to get rid of some of the bureaucracy that's there, but how do you even start to make inroads into it? I've seen firsthand what it's like in a public organisation that has a lot of middle and senior management, and it always feels like it will feel like this in the NHS, it will feel like it in the police. Every time there's a savings plan, it feels like it's the people on the ground who are going, not the people who are higher up. So how do you make inroads into that?
Well, I think from my experience of what we've done in policing, what I've done in local authorities in the past, in terms of how you manage that and how you deliver, and I think this is going to be one of those issues that potentially Andy Burnham has to deal with in the coming months. How do you actually deliver in government? And it's about setting what the outcomes are going to be. That you don't measure your activity by the volume of stuff that's going on in the background. And isn't this great? We've had a whole other load of meetings to move things forward. Your outcome has to be the target. So in the case of the GP surgery in Didcot, it's about setting a date and saying, this is really clear. What we need is the surgery to be open. Everything else is working back from that. And what we far too often find in terms of the bureaucracies is everybody worrying about their own little bit of the programme and measuring success by some progress towards the goal, rather than actually saying, no, the only thing that matters is getting the results. And where you see the most effective ministers of all parties, actually, you've got things done. I remember seeing this with someone like Eric Pickles when he was in the local government department. You see it. I mean, it's not someone I generally admire, but if you look at Ed Miliband, for all his failings about where his policy is going, he's been effective at getting his department to do things by being really clear on what the objectives are and being laser focused at making sure that he drives civil servants to fit those objectives and actually deliver on them. So I think it can be done, and some of the most successful politicians we had across the board are able to do it, but that's the model you need to have, not looking at the activity but looking at the outcome.
But the people facing the cuts, facing being moved, they don't like it.
No, and you will meet resistance along the way, often from those people within the organisation. But you need to be ruthless. You need to say, we're not here. I have great affection for Thames Valley Police and the officers and staff that I work with all the time. But I'm really clear, I'm not there to serve the police and to help the police have an easy life. I'm there, along with the police, to serve the public. And it's the same in the NHS. The doctors and nurses and staff in the NHS that do a fantastic job and rightly deserve our respect, but they're there to serve the public. And as soon as they stop serving the public and start serving the bureaucracy around it, and one of my greatest frustrations about the NHS is the way governments laud us to protect the NHS. No, the NHS is there to protect us. It's supposed to be a service. And I think we do have a challenge in this country sometimes around, it shows how much the bureaucracies have grown up. I see this with our local county council and some of the bureaucracy we've seen around our rubbish tips and booking systems being imposed. Are our public services there to serve us, the public, or are we, the public, there to serve those bureaucracies? And too often we're being asked to fill in forms and register for things, and a little bit of that makes some sense in the modern world to make things work smoothly. But actually, what's the objective? And the objective has to be about the delivery for the public. And as soon as we lose sight of that, then we're lost.
Because then you have a system which is failing patients, pupils, residents living on housing estates, but it's also failing the workers, it's failing the teachers, it's failing the doctors, and then they end up leaving those professions, and the problem becomes even bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a school governor as well, and you think in a school, the focus has to be on that child's education and safety, and the teachers are a really useful tool to doing that. We need to keep our teachers happy and keep them in employment and keep them supporting our children. But actually, the focus has always got to be the children. It's the same in the NHS. It's the same in our police and our military. The thing that matters is the outcome, is the goal. It's not the outputs you have along the way, and that's where I think a lot of our politics has become distracted, because it's very easy for politicians to fill the media with the activity of stuff that's going on. What we need is results.
What about net zero? Because it was implemented under the Tories. It's seen as controversial. We pay money for it on our energy bills when cost of living is very high. Some people would argue we shouldn't be doing it because we're so small, it makes no difference. Other people say we are small, but it does make a difference and it's really important for climate change. What's your view on it?
My view is we need to be practical about it rather than ideological. And I've never been a massive fan of, I've never been a fan of the net zero policy as it was, because it is a specific government policy. I think one of the big failings, and it's certainly a failing of the last Conservative government, was to legislate for things that should be policies, because that then leaves you open to challenges in court, for judicial review, for all sorts of other things, and it actually stymies effective government. So there are far too many things that government have legislated for when they ought to be policy positions that you have the confidence of your conviction to drive through. That's one problem. But actually, we need to look at not only the impact that we can have. I don't think there's anything wrong with suggesting that we should continue to transition to more renewable energy. There's a very good argument out there that in the long term, renewable energy will be cheaper for us, and the infrastructure will be better for us as a country, that will end up with a better environment, and hopefully we can drive some of that change internationally. However, we also need to recognise that in the world we're in now, we need again to focus on what matters to the people we're here to serve, what's going to help people today in the UK, in Oxfordshire, in our part of the world, and that's what matters. A really good example of that is the ban on air conditioning units. At the time of recording this, we're through the middle of a heat wave. There are lots of people desperate to have air conditioning. We've got schools closing because head teachers think it's not safe to have children in schools in high temperatures. And the solution to that is obvious, that we need to improve our building stock, and part of that improvement is to install air conditioning more widely if we're going to see higher temperatures. So we need to think about mitigating the impacts of climate change as well as simply trying to stop it, because in the context of how we stop it, we are a tiny player, a tiny percentage, and the efforts we make to stop climate change are negligible. But what we can do at the same time is look at how we mitigate that change. So I would argue looking at improvements to, for example, air conditioning and making that a more common feature in the UK seems a sensible reaction.
The lack of air conditioning in the UK seems crazy. From a school's perspective, I mean, people go to work in their air-conditioned car, they get on the air-conditioned train, they go to their air-conditioned office, but the children are in boiling hot classrooms with no provision.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course that needs some money up front for investment, but actually it's a relatively small one if we can keep schools open for longer periods and if we're going to see higher temperatures generally. So we can manage this. We can mitigate against those things. Now, along the track, there's no harm in saying that actually our energy network, our electricity grid needs to be strengthened because we're using more electricity and less gas, and actually we need to look at how we're generating that. But now, as we are at the moment, we have oil and gas, which is not being properly exploited within the North Sea. We're importing this stuff. It's not as if we're not using it, but we're buying it from other people. It absolutely, in my view, makes sense to use what we've got. But I don't think it needs to be an either or. I think it's a strange debate that says that we have to stop extracting our own oil and gas from the North Sea, and that automatically means that we can never look at better use of renewables. I think we absolutely need to embrace nuclear energy more in this country. I find that the conversation about nuclear energy really interesting and slightly bizarre for someone who's grown up so close to Harwell. We have the legacy of the world's first nuclear reactor just down the road. We have experimentation around nuclear fusion going on just down the road, and yet there is still a sort of a public hostility, the fear around nuclear power. Well, we all live pretty close to it actually in this part of the world and have done so safely for generations. I think there is a very good argument for a significant investment. The investment we have had has taken too long. It's been dependent on the Chinese to deliver our nuclear infrastructure, and it's just not delivering on time. But that's got to be part of the solution, surely. So I think you can do both. We should be exploiting the oil and gas reserves that we've got at the moment because we've got an economic challenge that can address, and we've got an energy challenge that can help to address. Does that mean we stop nuclear power? Does that mean we stop looking at renewables? No, of course it doesn't. And I think it's a strange position we've got ourselves into where you seem to be able to have to choose one or the other.
Do you think there's an issue around self-sufficiency, that the UK isn't self-sufficient. We rely on other places for our fuel. We rely on support for our defences from other places. We rely on immigration to fill jobs that aren't being filled by people who live in the UK. Is that an issue? And if it is, how do you tackle that?
I mean, it undoubtedly is. You have to look around you, but it's not a new one. We are an island nation, and we've often been reliant on our imports and exports. One as an asset in terms of the trade that we have with the rest of the world, but I think we do need to look at the world and recognise it's a much more dangerous place than it has been. I don't think it escalates that tension to say that we should be more self-sufficient. It's recognising the risks that are presented to us. So you're looking at exploiting our own oil and gas, for example, to the fullest extent seems like an obvious thing when one of the alternatives is buying either from or through third countries from Russia, who are clearly acting as our enemy at the moment. So we absolutely need to be looking at both the energy, defence, employment markets and thinking more fundamentally about what we want from our country. But that slightly goes back to my point about, certainly as a state, being more realistic about what it is we think the state can and should deliver for the public and learning to live within our means accordingly. And also, I think as individuals, as families, being a bit more self-sufficient, going back to that, less reliance on the state and more reliance, trusting the public a bit more, freeing up our small businesses. When we talked about businesses in the past as governments, it's been about the FTSE 100, and it's actually really important that we have a thriving services and financial sector. But the vast majority of people in this country are employed by small and medium-sized businesses. And yet they are the ones often who bear the brunt of over-regulation. So freeing up those local small businesses and actually getting the government out of the way is one of the ways in which, as a country as a whole, we can be better off.
This is the 10th year since Brexit. Do you think Brexit was a mistake?
No, I don't, because I don't think it's ever a mistake to trust the British public. As someone who's been in politics all of my adult life, I think the worst thing for any politician to do is blame the public for getting the wrong answer. And I think you saw some of that from Nigel Farage after the Makerfield by-election, where he was castigating people for not voting for his party. I think that's always a mistake. I supported Leave. I'm very comfortable with that position. But I think wherever you are on that spectrum, we need to accept the verdict of the British people. And I don't think that there is any appetite now from the vast majority of people to rejoin, as the Lib Dems seem to want to be pushing. I think, firstly, there isn't the appetite for it. I think it would only stir up an awful lot of those old wounds that many people thought they'd put behind them. And also, I don't think it would be advisable economically or constitutionally or diplomatically. We would be going back into a very different European Union from the one we left. It's not what the public want to see from our politicians. What Brexit did give us was some freedoms to do things differently. Now, with freedom comes responsibility. I'm sure that's a quote from someone. The difficulties after Brexit, partly caused by some of the political opposition to Brexit and our own politicians frustrating us as a nation from moving forward. Undoubtedly some failures by people of all parties in terms of how they use those freedoms. But you know what? That's one of the reasons I voted for it. I'm very happy to have politicians running this country that I might disagree with if they're democratically elected, and then I can argue against what they do. And at the next election, you can get rid of them and you can get someone else in to do things differently. That's a freedom that we didn't always have as part of the European Union, because so much of our national life was prescribed in a way that national governments couldn't actually change. So things like, a really good example would be VAT on school fees, a policy that I don't support. I think it's been hugely damaging for the private school sector here in Oxfordshire, which has a significant number of private schools. It put a huge impact on many families who weren't mega wealthy, but simply trying to give the best opportunity they could to their children. It's put more pressure on our state schools, who aren't seeing all the money coming through from this great VAT bonanza. But that's a policy that wouldn't have been able to be implemented if we were in the European Union, because we wouldn't have been able to change our VAT rates. Now, I might disagree with that as a policy, but you know what? I'm actually quite pleased that the British government have got the ability to change that policy without referring to someone else, because I would like not just to reverse that, but to change our VAT policy around hospitality. You know, our hospitality businesses are paying far too much in VAT. It's outrageous that they pay the same rate on VAT for their products when often some of the things being sold in the supermarkets are the same thing. They're zero rated for VAT. So we ought to be able to use these freedoms that we've got post-Brexit, not to refight an argument of 10 years ago, but if people don't like it, we've now got the freedom to have a government that can do what we want.
What about defence? Because obviously this has been a very difficult year in terms of the conflicts in Iran. I think people feel in Britain, feel in the UK that we are a strong nation. We have all the legacy that we are making up for with empire, where we ruled the world at one point. And now it feels like our ships don't work. And, you know, they want support, but we can't really give it. Not yet, not until something's fixed. How damaged do you think our defence has become, our defence systems have come over the years, and how have we got here?
So I think the debacle, frankly, of getting HMS Dragon to the Mediterranean was a wake-up call, probably not so much for the establishment, because I think people I know who've got a much better understanding of military issues and have worked in the defence world for a long time have seen this coming and have warned of this. But it was a wake-up call for the public, who again, I think, even if it's not days of empire, within living memory have visions of the fleet sailing to the South Atlantic to liberate the Falklands, and realising that we can't actually manage to get one frigate to the Mediterranean in reasonable time. That was a bit of a shock for people. And sometimes those shocks are quite helpful, because undoubtedly the failures to properly fund defence have been cross-party over many years. So this isn't a massively party political point. But what we're faced with now is putting defence higher up the agenda. And I think that's important, because most of the time, most people don't think about defence. It's not on their radar. Therefore, politicians don't prioritise it, and therefore we don't spend anything. That's what's happened over the last 20 years, frankly. The public don't care, so politicians don't care, because you're not going to win any votes by spending more money on stuff that nobody ever sees, that goes on behind the scenes when people want money going into police, education, and health. What I think the Dragon debacle and everything that's followed on from that has made people realise is we do actually need to start thinking about investing in our infrastructure. The fact that we've got more police officers in England and Wales than we have soldiers in the British Army is, I find personally, very concerning. For someone who spends their life being told that we haven't got enough police officers, the idea that we've got more police than we have soldiers is not a reassuring fact for most people. So we do need to be, again, really upfront with people, have a very frank conversation. Our role in the world is different than it has been centuries past, but that still means we need to balance hard power with the soft power that we still have. And actually, one of the things that makes our soft power credible is having a hard power alternative next to it. There are loads of new technologies which are out there. You know, we've seen the live laboratory of warfare, which is Ukraine, which started off with heavy tanks being used by both sides, and has ended up in huge innovation around drones. I don't think we should never put all of our eggs in one basket in terms of the technology or the people, but I think that proves a really interesting template that we should be looking at, and I know lots of people in the defence world are looking at, but it does need to be funded. It needs a long-term plan, and the lack of a defence investment plan is one of the things that has absolutely contributed to the downfall of the Starmer government. We will see if Burnham actually wants to address that and really tackle it, or if they just try and find a way of fudging it and kicking the can down the road again.
So many things in the UK make people feel vulnerable, I think, which is about the shortcomings of the NHS. It's the realisation that maybe our defences aren't where they need to be. It's the provision in schools. A majority of people, I think, want to feel secure. They want to feel confident. They definitely don't want to feel vulnerable. But there's a strong sense that the country also wants change. So it's, I want to feel confident, I want to feel safe, I want to feel secure, but I want something different than I'm currently living through. What would you change, and how quickly would you change it?
So I'm an optimist in life. I think your analysis is quite right. People feel pretty dejected about stuff these days. I think some of that comes from our politics. If you look at the likes of Nigel Farage and Reform, their entire message is the country's dreadful, everything's broken, and it's all someone else's fault. There's no positive vision there. I think that actually the message that Kemi Badenoch is crafting and delivering increasingly well is one of optimism. It's saying we recognise there are plenty of challenges, some of which undoubtedly are legacies of previous governments, and I don't think Kemi or anybody else should shy away from that. But it's about having a positive vision for the future. So some of the things we've talked about being really ruthless, about saying to the public the things we can't afford to do, and frankly we shouldn't do, but trusting the British people to, one, make the right decisions and respecting the decisions they make, but also just to get on with their lives. So I think that vision of a smaller state that is actually effective, that can deliver the things that people need to have delivered, that then enable us to go on and live our lives. That, I think, is the really important thing. I think that does provide a vision of hope. And I think it should be about empowering people. Far too often, I will come across people who've got a challenge, and there may be an element that we can do something to help through the policing or the local council to get something out of their way. But the message is often about giving that person the agency to go and turn their lives around themselves. If you think about the problems around the benefits bill, the biggest financial challenge this country has at the moment, it's not the only problem we've got, but if you could tackle the benefits challenge, it would free up significant funds of money for other bits of public expenditure, such as defence, that are definitely needed. If we portray the benefits problem as being entirely negative, if we've got these people who are freeloaders and we just need to cut the bill, that's a really negative way to approach it. I would say we've got millions of people in this country who have great potential, and it is a genuinely good thing for them and for the rest of us if they are able to work and contribute something, not just to wider society, but to their own family. The sense of satisfaction, we can all have difficult, hard days at work and come home feeling knackered, but that sense of satisfaction when you've done a hard day's work and earn a hard day's pay, that for me outplays anything over just lounging around and doing nothing and feeling you've achieved nothing with your day. We've all had good days and bad days, and the best days are where you've achieved something. That's what I always strive for. That's why I like to be busy. But I think in that, whether it's about welfare or whether it's about wider issues in society, there's a real message of empowerment for the British people to say, actually, we can be positive. There is a positive vision for the future. There's loads of problems we need to solve. We can only solve them together. Government isn't going to come in on a white charger and fix all the problems. Government needs to do the things it can fix, and then we need to work together on it.
A bit like with the police, there's confidence though, isn't there? People may be feeling the pain under Labour in different ways, but they also have long memories, I think. And a lot of what we're living through now was either not tackled or was put in place by a previous Conservative government. So how do you, a bit like with the police, how do you get that confidence back in your party?
I mean, undoubtedly that is a huge challenge, but I think it's firstly it's about leadership. I think it comes from the top in terms of what Kemi Badenoch is saying, being very frank with people. I think it's what we can demonstrate locally. It's what I always try to do, not just from a party political perspective, but actually, again, going back to the fact I want to feel I've had a well planned day and actually achieve something. Actually, I want to do things for the right reason to support the public. So demonstrating what we can do on the ground now, accepting where there are failings, and being really frank with people that the people who are offering you everything and saying you can get everything for free are lying to you. There are trade-offs that need to be made in life. There are trade-offs that governments need to make in order to deliver things for the public. So we need to be frank. We need to have those conversations, and we need to be clear on what our principles are, because there'll be lots of people who disagree with me. There'll be lots of people who disagree with the Conservatives. That's fine. I'm happy for people to disagree with me. It would be really boring if we agreed on everything. But what hopefully we can agree on is that there are some really positive years for Britain ahead, and that actually, if we get the public policy right, then it's the people of Britain that will be really strong.
Matthew Barber, thank you very much.
Thank you.